Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. On a freezing morning in the winter of 1941, a Leningrad policeman found a woman dead where she stood in a bread line, her ration card still frozen between her fingers. People around her didn't scream or scatter. They simply stepped around the body and moved forward because stopping meant risking their own survival. In a city already stretched to its breaking point, death had become something acknowledged with the eyes but not with the voice. The siege had not yet fully arrived, but its shadow was already settling over everything. Before the war, Leningrad had been a city of art and intellect, its avenues buzzing with engineers, its theaters glowing with music, its boulevards alive with quiet elegance. 3 million people lived between the Neva and the Baltic, believing their culture and legacy made the city untouchable. But to Hitler, Leningrad was the birthplace of Bolshevism, a threat to be erased entirely. When the German invasion struck in June 1941, the Red Army was still reeling from purges and disorganization. Divisions collapsed in the Baltic like sand walls hit by a rising tide, and hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers vanished into captivity. By late summer, Army Group North stood at the outskirts of Leningrad, and German officers wrote that the city felt as doomed as a candle in the wind. Leningrad suddenly had mere weeks to prepare for a siege that would last nearly 900 days. Civilians mobilized with desperate instinct. Office clerks, students, engineers, and women who had never touched a shovel carved trenches around the city. Others hammered barricades together from scavenged timber and metal, anything that could stop a tank. The defenses were improvised and uneven, but carried the force of millions refusing to surrender their home. As summer turned to autumn, the last land routes slipped away. Germans advanced from the south. Finns pressed from the north, leaving Leningrad connected to the outside world by only Lake Ladoga. It was here on this fragile lifeline that the fate of the city would soon depend. Everyone sensed what was coming. Leningrad braced for a test unlike anything in modern history. More than 600,000 civilians would die before the siege ended. But on the eve of encirclement, Leningrad still stood cold, terrified, unprepared, but unbroken. By late August 1941, the German advance tightened around Leningrad in a slow, spiraling squeeze. Army Group North shattered Soviet defenses across the Baltic, leaving behind burned-out tanks, abandoned rifles, and entire divisions swallowed by marsh and forest. What remained to defend the city were reserve units, militia battalions, and factory workers who had traded overalls for rifles they barely knew how to use. Yet they marched anyway, taking positions in trenches dug by their own families only weeks earlier. The German assault came with crushing momentum. Artillery battered roads, bridges, and rail lines leading into the city, while Luftwaffe squadrons rained bombs on junctions and depots. Each explosion cut another artery feeding Leningrad's population. Civilians working in the streets felt the tremors of the front creeping closer by the hour, the sound of distant bombardment blending with the whisper of an approaching famine. By early September, the situation turned catastrophic. The Germans seized towns anchoring the last rail links, while Finnish forces closed any northern escape. Only Lake Ladoga remained as a fragile corridor to the outside world, exposed to enemy fire and barely functional. When German troops captured Schlüsselburg on September 8th, the final land route snapped shut, sealing 3 million civilians inside the largest urban trap of the war. That same day, bombs ignited the Badaev food warehouses, Leningrad's primary stockpile of grain and sugar. Flames devoured thousands of tons of supplies as black smoke drifted across the city like a curtain closing on hope itself. Mothers watching the sky understood immediately what this meant. Winter would arrive with no reserves. The enemy had not yet stormed the streets, but hunger had already entered the city. Hitler's orders left no doubt about the fate planned for Leningrad. The city was not to be occupied or negotiated with. Surrender was explicitly forbidden. The population would starve behind the encirclement, dying unseen in a place the Reich intended to erase. In Berlin, this plan was discussed in cold, clinical terms. In Leningrad, it translated into a simple truth: no one inside the city was meant to survive. Yet when German infantry probed the suburbs, they found resistance far fiercer than expected. Workers from the Kirov plant fought beside Red Army units in positions they themselves had built, while teenage cadets manned machine guns with a steadiness far beyond their years. The Germans had anticipated collapse. Instead, they met a city fighting with the desperation of people who knew the line they held was the last before annihilation. Unable to take Leningrad by force, the Germans turned to siege warfare. Artillery batteries dug in south and east of the city, sending shells into markets, tram stops, and residential courtyards. Lights flickered out as power stations failed, water lines froze or burst, and families melted snow over scraps of burning furniture. Darkness settled each night like a physical weight, and as the noose of encirclement hardened into permanence, Leningrad understood that the battle ahead would not be quick. It would be a test measured not in days, but in endurance. By the time the encirclement was complete, Leningrad had become a city moving through ruins with grim, deliberate purpose. Bombardments tore open buildings and peeled away facades, exposing bedrooms and stairwells like cross-sections of a wounded organism. Yet the destruction became a resource. People climbed through rubble, searching for door frames to burn bricks, to rebuild stoves and metal fragments to trade or repurpose. Infrastructure failed in slow, shuddering collapses. Water lines burst and froze into jagged sheets of ice. Tram rails twisted under cratered streets. Repair crews rushed to patch breaks, even as new shells fell around them. Every repair lasted hours, sometimes minutes, but the work continued because the alternative was surrender. The city was bleeding, but it refused to stop moving. Leningrad's factories fought their own battle. The Kirov plant welded armor plates in workshops so cold that lubricants stiffened like wax, and workers slept beside machines to avoid the energy cost of walking home. Ammunition plants rattled through the night as artillery echoed outside their walls. Workers were gaunt, exhausted, and half-starved, yet every shell they produced was an act of defiance. Proof the city still mattered, still resisted, still lived. Food scarcity reshaped daily existence. With reserves destroyed and roads cut, ration cards became lifelines, thin slips of paper worth more than valuables or clothing. Losing one meant losing the right to eat. People lined up before dawn with empty bags and hollow eyes, stamping their feet in the cold as they waited for bread that grew smaller and grayer with each passing week. They held each loaf like borrowed time, dividing it carefully to stretch the day. Water required equal struggle. Residents dragged buckets to the Neva or melted snow in pots set over tiny stoves built from scavenged bricks. Children carried water upstairs for elderly neighbors, leaving wet trails on frozen steps. These acts of quiet cooperation shared heat, shared water, shared strength held neighborhoods together, even as the siege tried to pull everything apart. At night, the city dissolved into darkness. Blackout conditions erased the familiar. No street lamps, no lit windows, only the faint glow of distant fires or the sudden flash of bombardment. Survivors described the silence between shells as unnatural, like the city itself was holding its breath. People huddled in communal apartments wrapped in layers of clothing, whispering stories to keep fear from taking root in the dark. And still culture refused to die. Libraries opened in freezing halls where readers turned pages with numb fingers. Artists sketched the ruins by candlelight, capturing a city suspended between death and defiance. These gestures were not luxuries. They were anchors, reminders that Leningrad was more than its ruins, more than its hunger, more than the siege trying to erase it. Winter was coming, and the city knew what that meant. The bombs had shattered buildings, but the cold would soon attack bone, flesh, and spirit with equal precision. Leningrad scavenged everything it could from the ruins because the true enemy, the one that killed without noise or fire, was nearly at the door. In the early weeks of the siege, Leningrad's defense resembled a patchwork held together by desperation. Red Army divisions had been gutted by the summer retreat, leaving battered regiments and half-strength units to guard the outskirts. To fill the gaps, the city mobilized everyone who could stand: older men, factory workers, students, office clerks, and women who had never imagined carrying rifles. They reported to assembly points still wearing work coats, determined because the line they formed might be the last between the city and destruction. Training was rushed and brutal. Volunteers learned to load rifles in courtyards dusted with snow, crouching behind broken walls, as instructors barked orders over distant artillery. They practiced crawling through frozen mud and throwing grenades with hands stiff from cold. Time was a luxury Leningrad didn't have. Readiness was measured not in skill, but in resolve. The trenches they occupied were the same ones civilians had carved into the earth only weeks before. Rough logs scavenged from parks served as supports, while doors ripped from abandoned apartments became makeshift reinforcements. These defenses were shallow, uneven, and constantly threatened by freezing ground. But they offered something the city desperately needed: a place to stand and fight. When German infantry finally tested these lines, they did not find a collapsing defense, but a city fighting for its life. Workers from the Kirov plant fired from positions they had dug themselves, while cadets from military academies manned machine gun nests with startling discipline. Women carried ammunition and messages under fire, moving across exposed ground with fierce determination. The Germans had expected fear. What they met was refusal. Casualties were immediate and brutal. Militia units lacked proper helmets and winter gear, and German artillery tore through improvised positions with devastating precision. Medics worked with dwindling supplies, improvising bandages from torn cloth and splints from broken furniture. Yet when losses mounted, new volunteers stepped forward, factory shifts ending one moment and marching to the trenches the next. Behind the lines, Leningrad's factories transformed into war engines. Workers welded tank armor, while artillery boomed overhead, and ammunition plants pushed out shells in rooms so cold the breath of laborers hung like fog. Many workers later fought with the very weapons they produced. The line between factory floor and front line, collapsing into a single shared purpose. Production was not merely output, it was survival expressed in metal and fire. Even air defense became a civilian duty. Students calculated firing angles for anti-aircraft guns, while women cranked searchlights to track bombers approaching from the Gulf of Finland. When the sirens wailed, these crews sprang into action despite exhaustion so deep it made their hands tremble. Their accuracy was imperfect, but every tracer that reached the sky reminded the city it was not defenseless. By November 1941, the transformation was complete. Leningrad, once a city of music, science, and quiet boulevards, had become a fortress of civilians turned soldiers. Their bodies were thinning, their strength fading, but their resolve only hardened. They were no longer defending only streets and buildings, they were defending the memory of what Leningrad had been and the hope of what it might one day be again. The first winter of the siege arrived not as weather, but as a sentence. Temperatures plunged below -30°C winds knifed through empty boulevards and snow-buried ruins where shells had torn the city open. With the rivers frozen and supply routes severed, Leningrad entered a stillness that felt like the air before a burial. It was in this silence that hunger revealed its true shape, slow creeping and merciless. Rations collapsed with frightening speed. Workers received only 250 grams of bread per day, dependents far less, and by December, unskilled laborers were given just 125 grams, the size of a matchbox. The bread, stretched with cellulose and husks, was barely edible, a dense gray slab that tasted of bitterness and survival. People cut it into thin slices, measuring each piece as though it were time itself. Hunger reshaped every movement. People walked with shuffling steps to conserve strength, leaning on sleds used to carry firewood, water, or bodies. Fainting in bread lines became common, and sometimes the fallen never stood again. The line moved around them because the living could not afford to stop. Stopping meant losing your place, your ration, your chance to endure another day. Desperation turned the city inward. Wallpaper glue was boiled into thin paste leather belts, simmered into broth crumbs, shaken from old carpets, were collected like treasure. The animals that once filled courtyards, cats, dogs, pigeons, vanished silently. Children asked where they had gone, but adults rarely answered. Some questions had no kindness left in them. Yet even as hunger hollowed the city, solidarity survived. Neighbors shared boiled water, split potatoes, and took turns tending small stoves that glowed weakly in freezing rooms. Children delivered buckets of melted snow to elderly residents, their footprints marking thin trails across icy stairwells. These small acts held families and entire buildings together, in a season designed to break them. But starvation had a darker edge. Theft rose, and ration cards, now more precious than gold, were guarded fiercely. Authorities documented early cases of cannibalism with grim precision, each report a reminder of how far human endurance had been pushed. It involved only a small fraction of the population, but its mere existence revealed how deeply the siege had torn into human limits. The most vulnerable suffered first. The elderly slipped away quietly in their sleep, their bodies unable to endure another frozen night. Children grew silent and thin, their voices fading as their strength declined. Doctors worked in hospitals colder than the streets outside, diagnosing dystrophy as a formal term for starvation. Each death felt inevitable, and yet every life saved felt miraculous. Through these months, the city clung to a single hope: Lake Ladoga. If the ice thickened enough, if trucks could cross, if drivers survived the journey, then perhaps Leningrad might endure the winter. But until that road existed, the city stood at the edge of annihilation, gaunt, freezing, and starving, yet still refusing to fall. By early 1942, hunger was no longer an absence of food. It had become a presence shaping every thought and gesture in Leningrad. People moved slowly, conserving each breath as if it carried weight. Bread remained the city's fragile anchor, but each loaf was now mostly fillers, bran, sawdust, cellulose, and whatever sweepings mill workers could gather. Families memorized the size of their rations before eating, afraid the next day's piece might be smaller. Hunger altered behavior as much as bodies. Arguments vanished because anger required energy no one possessed. Neighbors spoke in soft tones, conserving strength. Even laughter sounded thin, breathless, and uncertain. Many residents experienced hallucinations, visions of bread loaves or steaming soups drifting at the edge of sight. Dreams became feasts, and waking up felt like loss. Hospitals fought a losing battle against cold and malnutrition. Doctors worked in gloves with the fingers cut off their breath, hanging visibly in the frozen air. Nurses fed the sick spoonfuls of weak broth or hot water, knowing each calorie could mean another day. Outbreaks of disease were miraculously contained, a testament to medical workers who were themselves starving. Death blended into daily life with terrible familiarity. People died sitting on benches or slumped near stairwells or curled beside ration lines. Their bodies froze within hours sometimes in haunting positions that looked almost lifelike. Collection teams moved through courtyards, pulling sleds, recording each name with bureaucratic precision, a final gesture of dignity preserved by a city struggling to retain its humanity. Families often kept their dead inside as long as they could not out of denial, but weakness. Carrying a body down icy stairwells required strength few still possessed. Some wrapped loved ones in blankets and dragged them slowly across courtyards, leaving thin trails in the snow. Funerals were brief, quiet acts. The cold ended every ceremony before grief could find words. Yet, even in this bleakest winter, a fragile thread of life held the city together. Neighbors checked on each other, shared rumors of supply convoys, and exchanged scraps of firewood. Committees organized water collection and fire prevention, assigning tasks to residents who could barely stand. In courtyards, families huddled around stoves built from broken bricks, warming their hands over tiny flames that felt like resistance. Culture refused to die. Libraries loaned books that people read beneath blankets, their fingers trembling. Artists sketched scenes of survival sleds pulled by starving workers, children reading by candlelight. And on August 9, 1942, the city witnessed something extraordinary. An orchestra of half-starved musicians performed Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony. Anti-aircraft guns silenced German batteries so the music could be heard across Leningrad and through loudspeakers into German trenches. It was a declaration that the city was starving but not dead. At the Institute of Plant Industry, scientists guarded a priceless vault of seeds, future harvests, while starving beside the very food that could have saved them. Not a single researcher broke the vow. Their sacrifice became one of the most extraordinary acts of scientific devotion in history. By the spring thaw, Leningrad had lost hundreds of thousands of people, entire families erased by hunger and cold. Yet the city still breathed weakly, painfully, but undeniably alive. In a place where survival seemed mathematically impossible, endurance itself had become the final act of defiance. Even at the height of starvation, Leningrad refused to collapse. Systems that should have died, transport education industry continued in flickering, stubborn motion. Trams still crawled along icy tracks, sparks jumping from frozen wires, as conductors stamped tickets with trembling hands. Seeing a tram move through a starving city was proof that Leningrad still lived. Schools clung to life underground. Teachers held lessons in candle-lit basements. Children wrapped in blankets writing with stiff fingers as artillery murmured outside. Parents sent them not for academics, but for rhythm hope and the reminder that childhood was not yet extinguished. Factories became miracles of endurance. Workers forged tank armor and shells in unheated workshops, collapsing from hunger, only to rise again with help from their comrades. German intelligence could not understand how a starving city still produced weapons at all, let alone at meaningful scale. Across the city, scientists at the Institute of Plant Industry guarded thousands of seed varieties, refusing to consume the very food that could have saved their lives. Their sacrifice ensured future harvests would survive, even if they did not. It remains one of the greatest acts of scientific devotion ever recorded. Postal workers delivered letters through ruins carrying envelopes that connected families divided by hunger and artillery. In a world where so much had collapsed, these messages became lifelines, proof that someone somewhere was still alive. Communities created invisible networks of mutual survival. Neighbors shared boiled water, kept watch over the weak, and pooled scraps of firewood to heat entire stairwells. In a city designed to be starved into silence, solidarity became its loudest form of resistance. Piece by piece, Leningrad showed that survival was not only a biological act, it was cultural, communal, and profoundly human. When the winter of 1941-42 tightened its grip, Leningrad seemed sealed inside a coffin of ice. Temperatures plunged below -30°C, freezing water inside homes and locking doors shut. But as Lake Ladoga hardened into a vast white plain, engineers saw not a tomb, but a possibility if the ice held it could become a road that might save a city. The first tests were almost ritualistic. Engineers crawled across the lake with drills, listening to the groans beneath their feet as they measured thickness inch by inch. Branches and poles marked faint roots across the snow, turning the frozen lake into a skeletal map. Drivers memorized every bend and distance, knowing they would travel in darkness without headlights. Before trucks, horses came first, pulling sleds loaded with flour sacks, medical supplies, and precious fuel. Their drivers wrapped scarves across their faces, bracing against winds that cut to the bone. Frost formed on their eyelashes, their voices muffled by layers of cloth. These early journeys proved one truth: the lake could be crossed. Soon convoys of ZS trucks crawled onto the ice engines, kept running so they wouldn't freeze. Drivers kept windows open to prevent fogging their faces raw and burning from the cold. German aircraft hunted them relentlessly, dropping bombs meant to shatter the ice rather than the trucks themselves. Every explosion sent shockwaves across the lake, threatening to tear open the path beneath their wheels. Despite constant danger, the drivers returned again and again. Many made dozens of crossings, becoming a unique brotherhood, defined by frostbite fear and resolve. Some wrote in diaries that each trip felt like driving over glass that could shatter at any moment. Others simply said, "We drive so the city may live." On the shore, starving civilians waited for the convoys. Unloading was frantic, flour spilling into snow workers scrambling to scoop it back with bare hands. Fuel drums rolled toward power stations like lifeboats pushed toward a drowning ship. Hospitals received antibiotics that saved hundreds of lives. Even a single truckload mattered. The road also carried people away from the nightmare. Thousands of children were evacuated across the ice, wrapped in blankets, and carried onto sleds by nurses. Parents, too weak to shout, whispered goodbyes at the shore. Many children never saw their families again, but they survived, and survival was more than enough. Night crossings were the most perilous. Drivers navigated by memory and by the dim silhouettes of poles stuck in the ice. If a truck broke down, death could come in minutes. Mechanics worked in tent workshops near the shore, repairing axles and frozen pipes with hands numb from cold. Each restored truck drove directly onto the lake engine, still steaming. Despite bombardment, ice cracks, and constant losses, the road of life endured. By spring, it had delivered vital supplies and evacuated more than 500,000 civilians. It did not end the famine, but it prevented total annihilation. And when the thaw finally shattered the ice, the road vanished, leaving behind only the memory of a lifeline carved across winter's grip. When spring loosened its hold on Lake Ladoga, the road of life dissolved into drifting shards of ice, and Leningrad's fragile link to survival thinned once more. But the end of winter did not bring relief. Instead, it cleared the skies and roads for Germany's next phase of destruction. Army Group North, shaken but not broken, reoriented its siege toward overwhelming firepower, the kind that required no movement, no maneuver, only relentless pressure. Artillery became the city's new tormentor. German batteries, field guns, howitzers, and even railway-mounted giants were dug into positions south and east of Leningrad. Many could strike deep into the heart of the city from more than 20 kilometers away. Gunners studied the rhythms of Leningrad, the hours when bread lines formed, when trams moved, when water collectors gathered at the river. Their shells fell not randomly, but with cruel purpose. Bombardment stitched terror into daily life. One moment people stood in line for their rations. The next, an incoming whistle sliced through the air, and a courtyard exploded into debris. Children learned to drop flat instinctively. Adults developed a sense for sound, reading milliseconds between whistle and impact, knowing when there was time to run and when there wasn't. But no instinct could save everyone. The Luftwaffe joined in whenever weather allowed. Bombers struck factory districts, power stations, and warehouses with mechanical precision. Their raids turned streets into trenches and rooftops into collapsing shells. Fire brigades sprinted between infernos with buckets and hand pumps that froze in their hands. Entire blocks burned to their foundations, filling the sky with an orange glow survivors described as a second malignant sunset. Still, the city refused to yield. Electricians climbed shattered poles under fire to reconnect wires. Carpenters patched windows with scrap wood. Apartment committees shoveled rubble from stairwells so residents could still reach their homes. Each repair was temporary, but each one was an act of defiance, proof that the city's functions would not die quietly. Meanwhile, the Red Army sought to break the siege from the outside. The Lyuban offensive attempted to cut through German positions south of the lake, but soldiers bogged down in marshes and forests turned killing grounds. The Second Shock Army was isolated, encircled, and eventually destroyed. Tens of thousands vanished into the woods east of Leningrad, swallowed by mud mines and machine guns. The defeat crushed hopes of liberation in 1942. Another attempt near the Sinyavino Heights fared no better. Soviet troops climbed slopes shredded by shell fire, advancing meters at a time while losing thousands. The heights remained in German hands, an artillery throne overlooking the approaches to Leningrad. Each failure deepened the city's despair. Even hope began to feel rationed. Yet endurance held. And in August 1942, something changed. A new commander, General Leonid Govorov, arrived, bringing with him a precise, disciplined approach to warfare. He studied maps, terrain, logistics, and morale with cold clarity. His presence signaled a shift. For the first time since the siege began, Leningrad was not only surviving, it was preparing to strike back. General Leonid Govorov entered Leningrad in 1942 with the demeanor of a man who measured war in angles, pressure, and timing rather than slogans. A former artillery engineer, he carried notebooks filled with sketches of firing tables and terrain contours. He studied the siege not as a hopeless crisis, but as a system with weaknesses waiting to be exploited. For a city exhausted by chaos, his calm precision felt like the return of gravity. His first task was to rebuild coherence. Regiments shattered by hunger were reorganized into functioning units. Artillery batteries were tightened into disciplined formations, supplied with new firing protocols and reserve barrels. Logistics officers worked through the night moving shells and fuel along routes that had to be protected at all costs. Under Govorov, the Leningrad front stopped reacting and began preparing. But while Govorov strengthened the city's defenses, the Germans prepared their own decisive blow. Hitler approved Operation Nordlicht, a massive assault intended to obliterate the city after Sevastopol's fall. Elite divisions, heavy artillery, and engineering units moved north with chilling purpose. Their plan was stark overwhelm Leningrad with bombardment, breach its lines, and erase it from the map. Govorov read the signs before the assault could begin. Working with General Meretskov of the Volkhov Front, he crafted a coordinated offensive against the Sinyavino-Mga sector. The objective was not glory, it was disruption. If Soviet forces attacked at the right moment, the Germans would have no choice but to redirect Nordlicht's assault units. Timing would determine whether Leningrad lived or died. In early September 1942, their offensive struck like a lightning bolt. Soviets attacked through forests and marshes under artillery fog, catching German units mid-redeployment. Gains were small, but symbolically enormous. Within days, German commanders halted Nordlicht, entirely rushing troops to reinforce collapsing positions. The attack meant to destroy Leningrad died before it could begin. The cost, however, was brutal. Soviet losses climbed into the hundreds of thousands amid swamps turned red by battle. Blizzards grounded Soviet aircraft, forcing infantry to advance without air support. German counterattacks hammered the assault groups, and the offensive stalled into another bloody stalemate. Yet strategically, Govorov had won. The city had been spared annihilation. For Leningrad, this was a turning point. Govorov had not delivered liberation, but he had prevented catastrophe. His methodical style reshaped both army and city. Soldiers sensed the change in the way orders were issued, in the precision of artillery support, in the confidence spreading through battered regiments. Civilians felt it too, as factories resumed organized production, and newspapers quietly shifted their tone. Still, Govorov understood that no single action could break the siege. He needed winter-synchronized fronts, stretched German reserves, and a plan that aimed not for miracle, but for mathematics. In his notebooks, a new idea began to take shape: a narrow assault corridor south of Lake Ladoga that could reconnect Leningrad to the Soviet heartland. It would be difficult, dangerous, and costly. But if he calculated correctly, it would be the first crack in the siege. By late 1942, the German siege ring looked immovable, thick, fortified, and backed by 2 years of experience. But Govorov saw what others could not. Beneath its surface were fractures born from exhaustion and overstretched supply lines. The German 18th Army was entrenched, yes, but brittle. And south of Lake Ladoga lay the one place where a breakthrough, however small, could change everything. That place was a narrow strip of land between the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts, a corridor only 10 to 16 kilometers wide. For more than a year, it had served as the choke point that starved Leningrad of all land access. If Soviet forces could pierce that corridor, even by meters, a supply route could be rebuilt. The siege wouldn't end overnight, but the city would breathe again. Operation Iskra Spark was designed with mathematical precision. Govorov and Meretskov synchronized their fronts like two jaws closing around a single point. Artillery prepared firing tables through endless nights, sappers mapped frozen forests, and infantry drilled in blizzard conditions. The offensive would strike on January 12, 1943, when deep winter finally hardened the swamps into passable ground. The Germans underestimated the danger. Distracted by the disaster at Stalingrad and convinced the Soviets were too malnourished to mount a major offensive, they read the buildup as defensive camouflage. Their reserves were thin. Their trenches, though strong, were poorly reinforced for winter assault. In their complacency, they left the door ajar. At dawn, the sky erupted. More than 800 Soviet aircraft struck first-dropping bombs that shattered communication lines and stunned forward positions. Artillery followed with a barrage so intense that survivors said it felt like the earth was vibrating. Then infantry surged through forests, and over frozen ground, rifles slung low as they advanced behind rolling smoke. Progress was uneven and brutal. When blizzards grounded Soviet aircraft, German machine guns regained dominance. Mines hidden beneath snow tore apart assault groups. Trenches changed hands repeatedly. In close-range combat, fought with bayonets, grenades, and flamethrowers. The casualty list stretched endlessly, but the offensive never stalled. It couldn't. Leningrad's survival depended on momentum. By mid-January, German defenses buckled. Counterattacks faltered. Reserves were thrown in piecemeal, and German commanders realized too late that the Soviets were not probing, they were breaking through. And then on January 18, 1943, history shifted forward. Elements of the Leningrad front met soldiers of the Volkhov front near Schlisselburg. After 500 days of isolation, the two fronts reunited. The corridor they opened was thin, exposed, constantly shelled, but it existed. Engineers immediately carved a narrow railway across it, the Victory Road, built in only 17 days under artillery fire. For the first time since 1941, trains carrying flour, fuel, and ammunition entered Leningrad by land. The siege persisted, but the city had taken its first full breath in 18 months. Operation Iskra had opened a wound in the German encirclement, but it was a narrow bleeding wound constantly struck by artillery. German guns targeted the corridor day and night, shelling the new railway, the workers maintaining it, and the supply trucks daring to cross. The lifeline kept Leningrad alive, but only barely. The siege had weakened, not broken. 1943 became a year defined not by heroic leaps, but by attrition. Hunger eased slightly as rations increased, but the city still lived under the shadow of empty shelves and thin meals. Schools returned above ground, only to dive back into basements when bombardments resumed. German artillery continued to hammer the southern districts, ensuring the corridor remained fragile and never fully secure. The Red Army tried to widen the breach immediately with Operation Polyarnaya Zvezda, Polar Star. On paper, it was ambitious: destroy the German 18th Army, liberate the entire region, and push the front westward. But the Germans anticipated it, withdrawing from exposed positions and shortening their lines before encirclement was possible. What was meant to be a sweeping victory collapsed into a costly stalemate. The front east and south of the city became a landscape of frozen devastation. Every trench bunker and forest path was fought over repeatedly. Soldiers described fields where trees were reduced to jagged stumps and snow churned into gray mud. Progress was measured in meters gained before being lost again. The siege ring flexed, but did not break. Inside Leningrad, life resumed in fractured but unmistakable forms. Trams ran more regularly, though wires still sparked above ice-covered lines. Small theaters reopened. Audiences huddled in coats while actors performed beside walls, pockmarked by shrapnel. Libraries circulated books as if they were medicine. These fragile cultural revivals helped the city reclaim pieces of itself. Hospitals, however, remained overwhelmed. Doctors treated frostbite shell wounds and lingering starvation disorders. Families brought tiny jars of jam or sugar as gifts to strengthen patients. Surgeons worked exhausting shifts, some collapsing mid-operation. Yet recovery rates slowly improved. The medical system, fragile but functioning, became another silent victory. Throughout 1943, Govorov continued shaping a long-term strategy. Artillery units perfected firing tables for every German emplacement. Sappers mapped bunkers and minefields with growing precision. Infantry rotated frequently to maintain strength. Each month of preparation tightened the coil of the coming offensive. The German 18th Army, starved of reinforcements, grew thinner and increasingly vulnerable. By autumn, soldiers and civilians alike sensed a shift. Newspapers adopted a more confident tone. Radios hinted at decisive actions ahead. German intelligence reported unusual Soviet activity, new trenches, new stockpiles, fresh units arriving quietly at night. The siege no longer felt like a static prison, it felt like a spring ready to snap. As the year closed, Moscow approved Govorov's next great effort, a massive winter offensive involving the Leningrad, Volkhov, and Second Baltic fronts. It would strike in January 1944, exactly 1 year after the breach created by Iskra. The symbolism was clear: the spark that opened the corridor would now ignite the fire to free the city. The winter of 1944 arrived with a tension so sharp it seemed carved into the air. After nearly 900 days of siege, Leningrad stood gaunt but unbroken, its factories humming. Its soldiers hardened its spirit, sharpened to a blade's edge. Govorov had watched the German 18th Army erode month by month, its units stripped to reinforce crises elsewhere. Now at last the moment had come. On January 13, 1944, the Soviet Union unleashed the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive. It began in darkness. Night bombers droned overhead in disciplined formations, dropping explosive cascades across German lines. Residents heard the thunder rolling from the horizon, not with dread, but with something close to disbelief. For the first time in years, the sky's fury was aimed not at them, but at the enemy who had tormented their city. Then came the artillery. Thousands of guns, howitzers, rocket launchers, mortars opened fire in a perfectly timed storm. Snow erupted in plumes as German trenches vanished under waves of steel. Communication wires, snapped observation posts collapsed, and entire units were cut off before they could organize a defense. Survivors described the ground trembling, as though a creature beneath the earth was trying to break free. Infantry advanced behind the barrage with disciplined force. The 42nd and 67th Armies pushed from the southwest, while the 2nd Shock Army drove from the east. Riflemen trudged through snow that swallowed their boots, their breath freezing into crystals. Tanks followed in grinding columns, engines straining in the cold, but pushing forward with unstoppable weight. German defenders fought with determination, but momentum had already shifted. Govorov coordinated the assault with surgical precision. Every breakthrough was reinforced immediately. Every German counterattack was drowned in pre-sighted artillery fire. The Red Army moved not as scattered units, but as a single massive organism. Soldiers later said it felt as if the entire city marched with them, its hunger, its pain, its fury carrying them forward. German command unraveled day by day. Reports arriving at headquarters described collapsing positions, shattered battalions, and severed communications. The Luftwaffe could do little under winter skies. Reinforcements were denied. Berlin had no reserves left to send. General Lindemann predicted the offensive would stall within days. Instead, his lines were disintegrating beneath him. Breakthroughs spread rapidly. The 2nd Shock Army seized key supply villages. The 42nd Army captured Krasnoye Selo, long used by German artillery to strike deep into Leningrad. With its fall, German fire control collapsed. Soldiers raised red banners over the ruins, calling it a sunrise after years of night. Within days, the German 18th Army was in full retreat, abandoning equipment, burning documents, and fleeing through forests and frozen swamps to avoid encirclement. Soviet troops surged more than 100 kilometers westward, reclaiming towns and villages that had been silent under occupation for 2.5 years. Inside Leningrad, the bombardments quieted. Streets once haunted by explosions now echoed with cautious footsteps. And then on January 27, 1944, the Soviet government delivered the words, "Leningrad had waited nearly 900 days to hear the siege was lifted." Not eased, not partially broken, lifted completely. The city erupted not with fireworks or parades, but with exhausted tears shaking hands and stunned silence. Civilians carried battered Soviet flags into courtyards. Soldiers embraced each other with emotions beyond joy. After years of starvation, cold, and death, Leningrad had survived. When the guns finally fell silent, Leningrad emerged into a city both familiar and unrecognizable. Snow covered the skeletons of buildings, and entire districts stood hollowed by fire and famine. Streets that once carried the footsteps of 3 million people were now quiet, thinned by death and evacuation. Liberation brought relief, yes, but it also unveiled the full magnitude of what the siege had taken. The human cost was staggering. At least 640,000 civilians died, most during the terrible winter of 1941-42, though the true toll may be higher. The Red Army's losses, defending and attempting to relieve the city, climbed into the millions. Cemeteries overflowed. Mass graves stretched in frozen rows on the city's outskirts. Survivors walked past these places daily, reminded that victory had been bought with their neighbors' lives. Cultural devastation scarred the city's soul. German forces retreating in rage burned or looted palaces at Peterhof, Pushkin, and Pavlovsk, treasures of centuries reduced to ashes. Museums were ransacked, paintings destroyed, or stolen archives lost forever. Yet even in ruin, these sites became symbols of defiance. Leningrad had been wounded, but not erased. Infrastructure lay in ruins as well. Water pipes shattered under frost gas lines, ruptured from shell fire, and tram tracks twisted into warped metal arcs. Apartments stood windowless, their facades pockmarked by years of artillery. Yet the moment the siege lifted, teams of engineers and workers, still gaunt from hunger, returned to their posts. They cleared rubble, relit power stations, and repaired the city block by block. The act of restoring electricity felt like turning life back on. Factories reopened almost immediately. Men and women who had fought at the front or worked through starvation returned to their machines with quiet determination. They built tanks, locomotives, ammunition, because though Leningrad had survived the war, had not ended. The city shifted from desperate defense to national contribution, proving that endurance could become strength. Sounds of normal life slowly returned. Trams rattled over repaired tracks. Radios played music instead of only announcements, and children's laughter echoed through courtyards once haunted by breadlines. These sounds did not erase suffering, but they displaced silence, the silence that had followed explosions, hunger, and loss. The city's voice was coming back. Psychological wounds, however, lingered long after liberation. Survivors hoarded food instinctively, fearing the return of empty shelves. Sudden noises triggered panic. Nightmares of bombardments and hunger persisted. Parents who had starved themselves to feed their children now watched them anxiously at every illness, terrified of losing what they had fought so hard to protect. Trauma did not end with victory. It became part of the city's memory. Families began to search for loved ones who had disappeared, soldiers missing in forests, civilians lost to shell fire, children evacuated across the ice. Lists were posted in hospitals, schools, and military offices. Some reunions were joyous. Many ended in grief. Still, the act of searching helped restore human connection piece by piece. In the months that followed, Leningrad committed itself to remembering. Writers recorded testimonies of starvation and courage. Artists painted scenes of breadlines and bombardments. Monuments were planned at mass graves and key battle sites. Memory became a form of armor protection against the erasure the enemy had sought. Spring returned melting ice from the Neva and revealing patches of new green pushing through the soil. Survivors saw these first leaves with overwhelming emotion. After years of cold fire and hunger, the return of warmth felt like a quiet miracle. Many later said this was the true moment the siege ended, not the day the Germans retreated, but the day the city began to breathe naturally again. In the decades that followed, Leningrad rebuilt itself street by street, gallery by gallery, life by life. Palaces were restored, museums reopened, and factories expanded. The scars of siege remained visible, but they became symbols of endurance rather than destruction. The city had been starved, bombed, frozen, and violated, and yet it refused to die. The siege of Leningrad is remembered as one of the deadliest in human history, but its legacy is not defined solely by suffering. It is defined by the will of a population who protected their culture, their city, and their humanity under conditions meant to erase them entirely. Liberation did not undo the past, but it proved an unshakable truth. A city can be broken in body and still unbreakable in spirit. Leningrad endured, and because it endured, the world can never forget.